on the Origins of Inequality. And last time we just talked about some of the initial ideas, including his critique of selfishness and self-interest that he sees in the society of his day, and the indication that human beings aren't naturally like that. So we talked a little bit about how sometimes people behave in what seems like an unnatural way towards their fellow man in high civilization by not having that initial feeling of pity or just natural feelings when they see certain things happen. And really the theme of this discourse as a whole is nature versus convention, or nature versus civilization. And he wants to draw people back to imagining that, human nature really does prefer a more simple, kind of primitive state, even though we can't go all the way back there, as I said before. Okay, so let's see. Let's start in with... let's start in on page 6 here. Just to remind you, Rousseau differs from both Hobbes and Locke in how he sees things that seem kind of on their face just good, like reason. Okay? It's counterintuitive in a way to think that human reason could be a bad thing, but he challenges that. And to get to that, he even challenges the value of speech, because, as he points out in this essay, first there's speech and then there's reason, at least as far as he thinks of it. This is how he imagines it, that initially, we have very rudimentary speech, but that's what it takes to build up human beings' reasoning capability. Also, he will be critical of property, which is something that both Hobbes and Locke approve of. Private property is, in both of their minds, the big building block of, development, basically, especially for Locke. And when I use the term suspicion there, what I mean by that is that both Hobbes and Locke see suspicion as something that emerges in nature itself. That from the very beginning, you have this natural suspicion of your fellow man. But Rousseau disagrees with that as well. He says that doesn't develop until quite a bit later, but initially there's not that much suspicion. There may be sort of gut level fear, like we discussed before, but suspicion means, imagining what is going on in the mind of the other and really building it up. And this is not, just not in the mind of primitive man. Okay, so has anybody taken an anthropology class? Okay, so how do anthropologists today generally depict primitive human beings? Say very early, human or proto-human societies.
Generally, they're going to be just almost exactly how Rousseau was saying. They're not gonna. I don't think speech came around until the species right before Homo sapiens, and so anything prior to that, there was no speech. They didn't do clothes. Most of the time, they only stuck around in very, very, very small groups.
You remember anything about burial or religion or anything like that?
Burials didn't start being found until early Homo sapiens. Before that, they wouldn't have any kind of, I guess, how we would put, our dead in coffins and bury them, and they're in suits and that kind of thing.
Right.
The earliest form of burial was they were laid nicely into basically a hole, and I think they found some fossilized flour, I think.
Yeah.
And that was the earliest form of concrete burial that they could find. But other than that, it was just bones in a heap, basically.
Right.
So where you died was where you died, and they didn't bother with burial. No signs of religion. Tool making, they did use tools in the later species, but in like the very earlier species they did.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, pretty much smart animals.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I asked about burial because it's at about that time when you start seeing any sort of, I don't know, thought about putting them in the ground, and that's when very early religion seems to have started, or some sort of belief that if you do things in a certain way, this will be good for the person. So in and around that time is probably when the human imagination started to be able to think about, is there an afterlife, or, you know, is there a spirit in the human being, or something like that. And so originally, that, you're right, that didn't take place. And just as with other animals, human beings died and just laid there, right? And so human beings at some point were, according to anthropology and according to evolutionary thought, just animals. And so we made this transition, probably gradual, towards something that seems to be so much more than that in a way. But there's still a lot of animal left in human beings. So it's kind of remarkable that Rousseau was able to use his imagination with very little. There was very little anthropological knowledge at this point, and what little there was badly done. It was based upon digs and things, but they didn't really know what they were looking at. It was more of a treasure hunt than anything else. He could use his imagination, but you can see the very challenging or threatening aspects of Rousseau's thought here, because he's, in the same way that Darwin threatened people's sort of conventional sense of what it means to be human, and whether religion is natural or true or not, and that kind of thing. That same sort of challenge is brought up here with Rousseau's writing, and he's just using his imagination. So, many Enlightenment people, many of the philosophers were comfortable playing around with these ideas, but these ideas weren't universally valued by the ordinary people of the day, and never were, and still aren't, actually, ideas like this. So he brings all of this up and depicts human beings as like animals, and this is not bad. Now, another conventional reaction to all of this, even if a person would entertain it, is, well, gosh, I'm sure glad that we moved out of that situation, and that human beings developed into something far better and more civilized than that. But he challenges that as well, that what we've done and what we've become is better than that. On page 381 on the left-hand side, which is 2 paragraphs in part 1, he says, when I strip that being, thus constituted of all the supernatural gifts he could have received, okay, so all of those religious aspects of the human being, and there he's implying that those are not natural, okay. So we strip him of all of the supernatural gifts and of all the artificial faculties he could have acquired only through long progress. When I consider him, in a word, as he must have left the hands of nature, I see an animal less strong than some, less agile than others, but in all the most advantageously organized of all. Now, why would he say that? First of all, in what way are we less strong, less agile? What is it about human beings that might make us not as strong and agile and so forth as other animals? What do we not have? What do we have?
We don't have, the teeth. We don't have the claws. We don't have the speed, I guess, like the musculature to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Most animals that have that run on 4 feet instead of just the 2.
Mm-hmm.
So, a lot of it's our biology that's a lot different.
Maybe when we were closer to primates, we had a lot of those things.
But even then, we didn't have the ankle structure like hares of the fast-running creatures that look the same.
Mm-hmm.
And apes are pretty big.
Yes.
They're not very big.
Right. Yeah, we don't have the teeth or claws. We don't have, actually, our sensory faculties are not as good. So like dogs and all sorts of animals, they can smell things so, such a subtle sense of smell that you don't even perceive it. They know the difference. My dog knows the difference between my dad approaching my door from 20 yards away, really, and some person who's not usually there. How does she do that? Well, it's either hearing or smell, probably hearing in that case. But I'm not perceiving it. I don't perceive it until he gets there. So it's quite extraordinary what they have. And of course, they have it because they need it, right? And I suppose as human beings developed their cooperation, they didn't need it as much because they substituted it with technology, with building the tools and weapons, and with, cooperating with each other for security and for gathering food and things like that. So we probably lost those qualities, over time. So in that way, we're disadvantaged. But he says also, but we're the most advantageously organized of all. And from reading more of Rousseau, why do you think human beings are still more advantaged, even in this natural state, than most animals?
Well, you just kind of said it, that working together with cooperation, like, that's something that no other animals have done.
Right.
The way that humans started to do.
And even before they started to do it, he kind of seems to assume that we have a greater thinking capacity. So this is, he's speaking before civilization develops, but I think he's still assuming that human beings are smarter. Maybe not nearly as smart as they are now, but they have the ability to do a little bit of planning and so forth. So, but they don't use most of that. That's why I find that sentence curious, because it doesn't quite go along with what else he says about human beings' primitive state.
But isn't it like kind of psychologically and biologically correct? Don't we only use the little part of our brain?
That's true. Yes, that's right. That's what they tell us anyway. How they know, I don't know, since they're not using all of their brain. You ever wonder about stuff like that? Okay, so they look at brain scans and parts light up and other parts don't, but our instrumentation may not be perfectly developed, right, to be able to see what the brain does. So I don't know, but that's what they say. And of course, if you try to develop an ability, you can do it. If you don't, you don't. So obviously we have a lot of learning capability that we don't use. So yeah. So maybe this is what he's talking about, but it doesn't really get used until a certain point in time. So what he says of them now, he says, I see him satisfying his hunger under an oak tree, quenching his thirst at the first stream, finding his bed at the foot of the same tree that supplied his meal, and thus all of his needs are satisfied. It sounds kind of nice, doesn't it? Inclement weather might be a problem, but you can always find yourself a cave or some place to get under. The tree might be good enough.
Polio, it's not so nice.
On what?
Polio and other...
Polio, yes, those diseases that kill you early that you have no ability. But then, and we do know that they didn't live very long for all sorts of disease and animal attacks and so forth. But then they don't know what death is, as he points out. So for the time that they exist, would they be happy? He seems to depict this sort of ignorance is bliss type of thought here, They're not deep thinkers. They certainly don't know that someday they will cease to exist. The worst thing could be that they would be attacked, and at that moment they would feel fear, but they're not anticipating that fear. They're not anticipating scarcity, even though that could happen.
It kind of seems like he, out of the three we've covered so far, it seems like he has a very realistic view of the state of nature, kind of what it was like in our primitive state. Like, he really analyzes that.
Yeah.
I think his view is the most spot on,
Closer.
in my opinion.
Yeah, I think you're right.
I think the only criticism that I would have is that he's kind of contradictory, that he's saying primitive man was primitive. He couldn't think ahead. He couldn't, do all these things. He depicts him as an animal, but then in that one passage he says that he's still better than all the rest of the animals. It's like
He's got this
Yeah.
capacity somehow, yeah, and it is.
which is kind of odd to me because there are cases of other animals, working in packs or that kind of thing. So it's like,
Right.
where is he actually pulling this from?
It seems to me that if I'm comparing this to Hobbes and Locke had a political purpose to their states of nature. So far with Rousseau, I'm not seeing as much of one. There's probably something still there, but it doesn't seem like he has much. He's like, this is what it's like.
It's not as calculated.
Yeah.
Yeah. You may be right about
And
that.
manipulative.
Part of that is because now we look at that and we say, that's closer to what we know is true based on our studies now. And part of it may be that Rousseau genuinely, what if he's got an agenda in here, and he does, it's just anti-civilization. He's negative about, all of these developments that he thinks have made people soft, but he hasn't gotten to the point of constructing his own political theory of what should replace it, or, what would he approve of, and that's what he does in the social
I
contract.
don't know if we're going to discuss it or not, but is that why he makes his state of nature seem almost better in a sense? Is he saying that, and this might be going on a stretch, but is he saying his state of nature is better than civilized society?
Yes, I think he is, yes. Now, he says there are detriments, early death, and maybe one of the biggest detriments that he will point out is that these human beings don't experience love, really. And he does end up saying love is something that, even though it is problematic, is also something that is very sweet, and that these people could not have experienced that. So he's not 100%, yes, let's all go back to the state of nature.
Thinks it's better than civilized society.
But yes, right, civilized society has become very bad for people. And so we need to reevaluate it, and this is part of that sort of holding it up to a mirror and saying, look where we've come from, is that this much better? It's really not. But yet, most people reading this would have been, not sure I want to spend my days, out exposed in nature, under a tree, foraging for food. Doesn't sound like that much fun. So, yeah, and Rousseau is using his imagination here. Like I said, he doesn't have a lot of scientific evidence like we do.
He really is a complete 180 kind of what he has some similarities to Locke in a little bit, but he's a complete 180 of Hobbes, it seems like.
Yeah, very, very, very different.
They're just reading him it sounds so much prettier.
Yeah,
than
it
Hobbes.
does.
That's why people like Rousseau. Rousseau seems nicer. Hobbes is very mean, and he's very, very negative. Now, Rousseau is negative, but he turns the negativity towards his contemporaries. But when he's painting his picture of how humanity really is, he's very positive. Human beings naturally are not bad. They are not selfish. Now, he makes a distinction, and we'll talk about this, between actual legitimate self-love and selfishness. They're not selfish. They're not looking for a way to take stuff from others just so that others can't have it. They do, like everything in nature, he would say, they do think of themselves first. But that's not necessarily incompatible with being concerned for others under certain circumstances. So, yes, it is a much nicer depiction and more realistic. So, let's look at why he thinks early man didn't have reason, and then how that developed, okay? And that's on page 8 now.
So this is how it developed.
How reason developed, right. Yeah, again, in his imagination, he speculates that originally humans didn't have any language at all. Like an animal, they made noises, okay? And as you know, animals can make different noises depending upon their state. So like a happy owl, for instance, makes a nice, pretty sound as it's out there in the middle of the night keeping me awake. I've got 2 owls. The other day, I think I heard either an owl battle or the 2 owls were beginning to have a family. I'm not sure what, but it was a totally different sound. I woke up the next morning and said to my son, Hunter, I think we're going to have baby owls in our future.
Before you know it, there's going to be 4 out there.
Yeah, there's going to be, and then 8. So it was a completely different sound, but it was still the owls. And you've heard animals fight, and they sound differently, you know, or one that's hurt, like a rabbit, when it's hurt, sounds like a bird. It sounds like it just screeches. And normally they don't even make a sound, or just a little peep. So this is the way human beings were at first. No language. And if you think about it, do you think without language? It's kind of hard to conceive. Like, in your mind, do you think very much without language? I know we have gut level responses without language, but like if you're actually thinking about how am I going to get to work today, or you know, what am I going to have for lunch?
The closest example that I would be able to think of is somebody who can't hear.
Mm-hmm.
Someone who's
How do
born
they
without
think?
hearing.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. If they learn how to communicate, though, don't they have to?
Because they can still see, right? So they
Yeah.
might not know what it sounds like, but they would probably register like the letters, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
Like
Yeah.
read.
Yeah.
Yeah, they can read, they can do sign language. Would a person without any ability to have any sort of sensory input be able to learn how to think? What kind of state would that be? Now, some people say, I had a family reunion last week, and my sister's husband is a believer in transcendental meditation. and he says you can think without words, and that's part of what transcendental meditation is all about, is thinking beyond words. But I think for most of us, it's kind of hard to imagine. You can feel without words, but thinking, especially if it becomes complex, is kind of difficult.
It's crazy to think about how far language did develop, though.
Mm-hmm. Well beyond
And
what
how long
you
it-
need.
Yeah, when did it happen? When people started forming coherent sentences, and eventually,
Mm-hmm.
it's just crazy to me.
Yeah, it had to have taken a long time. And Rousseau thinks that it did, but that it was sped up by certain events. So, and again, this falls back on his belief that human beings have more mental or intellectual capacity. That's a little bit of a problem here. But when certain things happen, like he mentions floods, fire, natural disasters that create scarcity or threaten these individuals' existence, because he's pretty much depicting people as individuals. They're not even forming little bands at first. They get together to mate, and that's about it. So these things, he says, force them to cooperate to a certain extent, and their cries started to mean more to them, and because of their greater intellectual capacity, they were able to see the value in creating a certain code, you might say. Okay, so at first it would be maybe an understanding that a certain cry means fire, or danger, or something like that, or I found an animal, come and help me. And it might have consisted of 5 sounds. Those sounds wouldn't have to be words, like there's a tribe somewhere that I saw a documentary about a long time ago, I can't remember, it was an African tribe. They click. They don't have words.
There's a whistling language in South America.
Okay. Whistling, yeah. or clicking.
It's like,
It could
It's like it's a complete language.
Where's
just
it
in
at
whistle.
there? Yeah.
I think it's in Peru.
Man, I need to go to Peru. I want to
Neat.
hear that. That sounds
But
cool.
yeah,
Yeah.
that's kind of interesting because like actually a species of monkey that they do cries. They have different cries for various warnings and things.
Okay.
Like, we found food, come get some food, and never
Yeah.
will show up, or like, you know, the documentary that we watched, they took this stuffed leopard
Mhm.
and put it on a stick basically and shook it out in front of them, and they started crying, and all of them hid up in the trees, and you know,
Okay.
they'd have something else out there and they'd do a different one. Just,
Mhm. Oh,
I
yeah.
thought that was interesting.
That is interesting.
But,
Proof Rousseau was right.
well, yeah, because when you say it, like there were other two like creatures that could have
capacity.
right. So,
Mhm.
but we're so far the only ones to, you know, surpass the
Yes.
cool cries and whistles
Right.
for the most part. So I mean, could he have been on, like in that case he was on to something?
Yeah, no, I think he was. Yeah, he had the right idea just by, I guess, being able to be very, very objective. You know, this was not easy to do, especially for people, even back then. It was the Enlightenment, but believe me, you know, that even most of those supposedly enlightened people couldn't have quite used their imagination to this extent. This is pretty extraordinary. And
It says right here that so the language and reason are not natural. Then.
right,
Okay.
that's what he's saying is that, and there's where I think I have a little bit of a problem, because how can you say that something is unnatural if it develops?
Yeah, that's what I was just getting ready to say.
Yeah. I mean, why couldn't you think of
Because
these
it had
developments
to start
as-
somewhere, right? And so wouldn't it be a
No,
natural
it was a
development?
biological development. Because I mean, if you compare like the throats of various Homo species and like the earlier man,
Uh-huh.
like they don't have the space for vocal cords until I think Homo erectus was the first one that showed signs of being able to speak,
Okay.
biologically able to.
So that would have come about through natural selection, right?
Yeah.
So those who were able to make these sounds would have survived at a greater rate than those who could not, which reinforced this over time. But yeah, I mean, I don't know that much about evolutionary theory. I was reading the paper that Steve Furtick's going to give at the honor conference on Friday, which, by the way, there's no class on Friday, so remember that. But he talks about there's a new way of looking at evolution in which culture and genetic mutations go hand in hand, so that culture is a part of your biological development. And, you know, you can see in the genetic makeup certain tendencies to develop certain cultural traits. It's interesting. So I've always wondered, why is it, and a lot of political thought, the little political philosophers do this, they will say this is natural and this is unnatural. But yet we don't do that with any other species than human beings. And with human beings, why is the development of all of these things, all not just language, reason, but science and technology and building, all those things, why is that unnatural for us any more than building anthills it's not unnatural for ants to build anthills, you know? So that's always bothered me. I think it's a way of stating your preference. This I prefer, and I call it natural. And I don't prefer this, so I call it unnatural. But you see in how he explains the development here, other animals would have also encountered floods, earthquakes, droughts, fires, and so forth, and they would have reacted to them in their own way. We reacted to them in our way, and this started something that, at what point does it become unnatural? So, is language and reason, are they really not natural? You know, Well, Rousseau claims that they're unnatural, right? They're development that lead us in the direction of something that's truly not good for us.
I think if you think about it in the I mean, I could maybe see it, like, obviously he said he doesn't like language, so that's convenient to make it unnatural. But like in the context of the animal kingdom, you might be able to say, well, it's not natural that this one group of species does something that no other group does, like on the scale level complexity that no other group does. But that doesn't make it unnatural for us.
Right.
Just like we don't use echolocation like bats.
Well, another thing from Ferdy's paper, he talks about how there's this one anthropologist, I think his name is Bowen, B-O-E-N, or B-O-E-M. You're familiar with him? Okay. So he says that, of course, for most of human development, when we were more like primates, that we had the same alpha male sort of situation as the primates, and so they, would fight for that position, and the alpha male would be in charge and generally keep order, but occasionally there would be these fights for dominance. But then at a certain point, human beings, through the same impulse to be, to basically be free of attack and oppression from somebody else, develop the capability of basically insisting that no one be the alpha male. And this is the beginning of political cooperation, according to him. They still have that impulse of dominance and of pride, you might say, or what we now call pride, but it comes out as in we're going to cooperate and not let any one of us get the upper hand. So he says that development is natural. It's a natural part of human evolution, and actually leads in the direction of what Ferdy calls isothymia, or the desire for equality. So it's an interesting argument. Rousseau would obviously not agree that could be a natural development. And a lot of evils come from our ability to communicate well beyond these fundamental cries, to develop this very sophisticated language that he is using right here to convey his ideas. Now, as far as, was early man vicious? Was he violent? Well, we've already talked about that to a certain extent. He looks at human beings as similar to other species in this respect. For the most part, they don't attack each other. Putting aside the fact that he doesn't agree that there was alpha males back then, okay? So he says they have a sort of natural instinct to preserve their species, so they're not prone to attacking each other. Very different from Hobbes in particular. They think of themselves first, but as I've said before, if they see another human being hurt or in trouble somehow, they have this feeling of natural pity towards them. Sometimes they're able to help, and they do. So there's this, temporary cooperation that can develop. But after that, they go their separate ways. He gets into the desires that the primitive person had. And he believes they're very different from the desires of civilized people. Okay? When they're hungry, they eat. They don't think about food until they're hungry, okay? Which is actually probably a good policy, but for most of us, I'm thinking about what am I going to cook for dinner tonight, right? Actually, before I left home, I pulled out the chicken legs. And, I look forward to, I actually like to cook, and I look forward to my cooking time. I'm not sure it's really appreciated by my son, because he doesn't know the difference between a hamburger and, filet mignon. But but it's a civilized thing, and I enjoy it, Or I think about, when will I get to go to Harry's again? Great restaurant in town, wonderful food, yeah. Way better than what I could normally do. So, we put a lot, we invest a lot in our food beyond, I'm hungry, what's laying around that I could eat? But not these people. I'm thirsty, where's water? And of course you can run into trouble if there isn't any, but this is, more like what he imagined animals to be like. They don't plan ahead. They don't think about hoarding, so this makes them different than the people that Locke would depict that want to accumulate more than they can use. They just use what they need. So they're not even burying nuts in the ground or, finding apples and hiding them, because who is there to dig them up? Other animals maybe, but not humans. They're not trying to plot and scheme and take things from each other. Not afraid of death. This is where he says they are afraid of pain. Let's see, down on the bottom of page 385, left side, he says, the only goods he knows in the universe, this is so Rousseau, are nourishment, a woman, and rest. The only evil, so it's all from the male perspective, ladies. The only evils he fears are pain and hunger. I say pain and not death because an animal will never know what it is to die, and knowledge of death and its terrors is one of the first acquisitions that man has made in withdrawing from the animal condition. That's a huge loss there, that you now know what death is, which colors your whole life. And it does. It makes everything different. And of course, many people say it's better because human beings put more into enjoying their lives because they know they're not limitless, but it's always there. But the desires are very simple, and he also says once they're satisfied, then they're gone. Okay? Outside of the need to fight, then human beings are lazy, you might say. Well, Locke would say lazy. Locke would look at Rousseau's humans and say, my God, no industry. So would Hobbes. No industry, This is, in their view, unnatural. Human beings were made to work and develop and improve their lives. And here we have Rousseau saying, man sits under a tree and senses the sweetness of his own existence in the moment. Okay. In the 19th century, Nietzsche made a similar statement in one of his first books. He said that the animal only lives in the moment. Human beings really don't have the moment. We don't live in the moment. We live in our heads. Whereas the animal is right there in the moment. This is another thing that those meditation people try to get people to do, is actually focus on the moment. When I had that, I don't know how many of you know this, but I got into an auto accident. I had a tremor, and one of the things that I was counseled to do was to try to do mindfulness. Well, mindfulness is you're supposed to actually pay attention to exactly what's going on right now. You wouldn't believe how hard that is. It didn't help either, by the way. It was completely wrong. But I could hardly do it to this day. I mean, I really did try because I was highly motivated. I could hardly do it. Can you imagine an animal? I mean, the animal situation is the reverse. They can't escape the moment. That's all there is that moment. No past, no future. At least for all but maybe the very highest level, maybe the dolphins or certain primates. But so this is, the way that he depicts them, and I think that from the liberal perspective, they do seem lazy. And why would anybody idealize somebody who just lays around, enjoying the sunshine and the trees and the water and all of those things? That's what we do when we try to have a vacation, when we go camping or something like that. As far as the family goes, he does discuss the relationship between males and females in nature, and it's very momentary. There is no permanent relationship or even semi-permanent relationship. It's really just mating, basically. Very, very different depiction of the family from Locke in particular. Although less so from Hobbes. Remember, in Hobbes, and he doesn't really go into this, but in the state of nature, everybody's an individual and everybody's afraid of everybody else, right?
So he says, just so I'm understanding this right, that so the father just leaves
Yeah.
the mother to do everything pretty much.
Right.
Okay.
The father would take no responsibility for the babies
Okay.
whatsoever. Now, in some animal species they actually do, but maybe Rousseau didn't know that, possibly. But I think based on his observations, what he saw was mating taking place, and then the mother taking care of the babies and the male going off and finding some other mate. Like the cat that goes all over the neighborhood making babies everywhere, but he doesn't come back to any particular one and take part in raising the babies. So, yeah, and this is a statement that Rousseau wants to make about male-female relationships. He does think that marriage is unnatural. It may be good under certain circumstances. I'm thinking of Emile and the marriage of Emile and Sophie. It could be good, but for the most part it's not. And we'll see why, but it's a lot of the marriage that he knew about in his society, he felt was oppressive, not to women necessarily, but to both parties, and too exclusive. The idea that you would be monogamous. Now, actually, as far as we know, Rousseau was voluntarily monogamous with Therese, as far as
gave
we
up all
know.
his children.
Yes, he did. And that's only as far as we know, too. Let's put it this way, he had a continual relationship with her for about 30 years. So that's pretty, even if he went off and had a few flings, that's pretty good for somebody who writes this, okay? So for whatever reason, But he never wanted to marry her, and I think you'll begin to see why. Because with marriage, you then have this obligation, this legal obligation that says we must stay together, no matter how we feel about it, okay? And for Rousseau, that's just terribly oppressive. It needs to be about how you feel at the moment. So yes, the father does not have responsibility for the children, which he certainly didn't take in his own personal life. And love, as we know it, does not exist in the natural state, okay? Love not being just a feeling, but a commitment, okay? So that doesn't go along with this. On page 392 on the right-hand side, he says, "Let us begin by distinguishing between the moral and the physical aspects of the sentiment of love. The physical aspect is that general desire which inclines one sex to unite with another. The moral aspect is what determines this desire and fixes it exclusively on one single object, or which at least gives it greater degree of energy for this preferred object." Maybe that was him. That was probably him, that last part. "Now it is easy to see that the moral aspect of love is an artificial sentiment born of social custom and extolled by women with so much skill and care in order to establish their hegemony and make dominant the sex that ought to obey." There goes Rousseau again. Okay. Rousseau did believe that. He did believe that naturally men should be dominant and women should obey. Okay. So he was not, I don't know, there were other Enlightenment thinkers at the time that were pressing in the opposite direction. Okay. He was simply not going there. He found it really obnoxious that women would get involved in, say, business or in intellectual pursuits. And there were a lot of women at this time that were holding these salons where they would get, people together and they would talk about issues, and women were even writing about what they thought about social issues. And Rousseau just thought this was just obnoxious and unnatural and unattractive, very unattractive. So this is one of his famous statements here where he just comes right out and says it. But in this case, he says women benefit more from marriage because then they get to control through their the fact that I know it's difficult to talk about, but the fact that they can withhold their sexual favors gives them control over the marriage. Okay, does that make sense?
That's kind of interesting because at the time, a husband and wife, there was no such thing as rape between those two, but it
Right.
did happen.
Yes.
So that's kind of interesting. that
Legally,
you
there
flag
wasn't,
that.
yeah. Mhm,
Yeah.
mhm. And a lot of women, we'll see, John Stuart Mill is in another generation or two, but even at this time, there were women and men who were beginning to question marriage on a completely different grounds, arguing that it really was disadvantageous to women, because when women entered into marriage, they lost all of their rights. They lost their right to their own property. They couldn't say, no, you're right. I mean, it was illegal, yeah. So basically, they were a dependent in the marriage. And yet Rousseau sees them as cleverly working this around to being dominant by sort of stringing men along because of their sexuality. This is going beyond what he says here, obviously, but this is the way he views the male-female relationship. So it's completely upside down in his view. Now, why should men be dominant? Well, probably because in nature they're stronger. That's about the way that Rousseau would think. What's natural is this physical desire, basically. And he says at the bottom of 392, limited merely to the physical aspect of love and fortunate enough to be ignorant of those preferences which stir up the feelings and increase the difficulties in satisfying it, men must feel the ardors of their temperament less frequently and less vividly, and consequently have fewer and less cruel conflicts among themselves. So there's less desire for everything in the natural state, including sexual relations, okay? Because the urge just happens when it happens, and people aren't thinking and planning and plotting ahead of time. Whereas in civil society, you have gossip and you have, talk and imagination and people trying to figure out, when their next liaison will be and so forth. So it becomes something that people want much more. He says, imagination, which wreaks so much havoc among us, does not speak to savage hearts. Each man peacefully awaits the impetus of nature, gives himself over to it without choice and with more pleasure than frenzy, and once the need is satisfied, all desire is snuffed out. Very simple. So we'll leave you with that.